Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of Change Itself. I'm here, Gus Miner, with Eric Demers. Eric, here we go for another episode.
We're doing it again.
Another one, and it's going to be an exciting one because we're touching on something a little bit different, which also affects our mining space. We've got a guest coming on shortly, Bradley Brodkin from HighVail in the GTA. I think it's going to be an interesting one, and it'll probably expose some of the information around how we handle information, especially with all the movement with digitizing everything and going paperless and whatnot. So should be a good one.
Absolutely. I was preparing for this podcast today, just really opened my eyes to how important the topic is and how much it actually affects mining, but kind of everyday life and everything that we do. So really excited to hear a little bit more.
Right on. So on that note, I'll introduce our guest. So Bradley, welcome aboard. Glad to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here. Morning, Eric.
Morning, Bradley.
Yeah, so we've been connected for a couple of years now with Bradley and his team. And as we navigate the challenges of the current landscape of computing, which is mostly cloud, right? So we have some of our friends that are, like AWS from Amazon that have really revolutionized the world on how we handle information and at scale, which is probably the biggest thing to keep in mind is that, there's ways that we can do things to satisfy certain needs, but then how do you scale? And I'm looking forward to hearing your interpretation, Bradley, on that. And maybe just to put a little bit more context is specifically in the industrial space or the mining space, there's a few things that happen where there's a requirement for information systems to live on their actual, on-prem, so like on their physical locations, because either that the internet connectivity is just not there yet, so they just don't have that reliable bandwidth. Which I think Starlink has now done a really good job at opening up the floodgates there. But also from the surety standpoint or the security standpoint, feeling that if it's in my house and I can touch it, I can feel it, I got a server that I can hold and put a blanket around it and coddle it, that I'll be safe from any cybersecurity attacks. So maybe that'd be one of my first questions, Bradley, is that, the perception around cybersecurity control between hosting your systems on the cloud or internal, is that something that you have a lot of conversations about with your clients around the due diligence of cybersecurity?
There's no question. And, I'm going to start off by saying we are not really a cybersecurity company ourselves. That's not our specialty. It's not our, as I use as a sort of a definition, it's not our lane. But I have partners that I work with who are very, very proficient in that space and already set up. Ultimately, clients are very concerned about the security, not only of their own data, but of their employees themselves, right? And the people within the company. It becomes a big concern of theirs as they look towards what they need to do. So at the same time, they say, if I can't hold on to it, as you just mentioned, if I can't put a blanket around it, how do I know that it's safe? And really, the cloud was created, and you mentioned AWS earlier, they were really the first player in that. And it came very simply from the fact that they themselves required more scalability, more flexibility with how they were delivering the end user experience, the client experience, to their partners who live within their own distribution centers or on their own, but really rely on AWS. So obviously the security around that, because there's not only the data of the individual of AWS themselves, but of the of the suppliers, but also the end user's data. So PCI compliance, right? Personal card, basically your credit card. There are compliance requirements for that. And the cloud is actually more more set up to deliver that to the customers simply and less expensive, less costly than a customer would do it themselves. Convincing the customers of that is the challenge that we have today, but it's absolutely top of mind. So that's a long explanation to say, yes, that's the first question out of their mouth.
And I guess some of the uncertainty comes from the fact that no one's really been able to properly explain what is the cloud. Right. There's like, it's just, we send information and it's up there and it's handled, right? Like they just think it's a magical, mystical thing that just holds information. But in reality, there's a lot of infrastructure in place. So maybe if you can dive into that at high level, how the cloud is created and where does it exist? I think it would help our audience understand a little bit more what the cloud even means.
The cloud exists on your own personal device, on your phone. Where's my phone? Right here. It exists there. And why I say that is that the cloud is really a peer-based network, both with secure, facilities that are designed, data centers that we've all seen in movies and a variety of different places. But it's also the data that's sitting on your phone, which is then, and I use this as an example for those of us that have Apple iPhones, we're using iCloud. That's one way to basically share the data. So the data resides both on your phone as well as within the infrastructure that Apple has set up. Where is it? It's everywhere. And the reason that I use that expression or that explanation of it is it started a very long time ago. The reality is that if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, that's where it started, but we won't go there. Not the sharing aspect, but really the automation aspect. And that led to a requirement of companies to have some kind of a network. There was something that was created. A lot of people know or have heard the term ARPANET before. Then there's a low-base satellite network. You mentioned Starlink before. That's what they use, their own satellites. Some of us use Sirius XM, which is a satellite-based radio system. It's using all of the same infrastructure, pieces of that same infrastructure, along with dedicated infrastructure that was built specifically to connect everybody together, everything together. So that's the cloud. So I have a tendency to talk a lot, right? So,
Bradley,
yeah, go ahead, Eric.
If I can. So just a question, because when you mention it's on my phone and it's on a data center somewhere, but it's everywhere at the same time.
It's because you're interconnected via network, right?
So we're interconnected. Is there like copies of this information on say multiple different servers and different data centers? Is that why we refer to it as being everywhere?
Yes, that's exactly what if you allow that. Obviously, you don't have to.
Okay.
I used to deal with a company who had a dedicated room for their employees to go out to the internet. They were trading securities, but they did not want to be connected to the outside network. So they had their own private network internally, and then a separate room where people could go out and with dedicated links in, right? So it used to be very dedicated. And today it's really an open infrastructure that we can create private networks, virtual private networks. Again, another term that everybody hears is VPN, right? A virtual private network. So once you start getting into that and you start getting into not only the sharing aspect, but really layering the security on top of that so that the data itself is secure between point A and point B, then all of a sudden you have a network. And then once you interconnect those networks, well, that's what the cloud is. It's that simple. It is that simple. And the ubiquity that we get today because of basically the data network that we have on our cell phones is what's going to take us to the next step. So you no longer necessarily have to have dedicated infrastructure. You can use a cellular network, which leverages, the network providers. And all of a sudden, you're limiting your need to manage it yourself, and you're just using it. Even as a large company, you become a user of it. And the security aspect of it is something that, depending upon what you need, it's really up to you to layer that security on top. I don't know. I hope I didn't make this too complicated.
No, I mean, it makes sense to me. But did that answer your question, Eric, overall? Or?
Yeah, I think because this topic's like like I'm aware of what the cloud is, but not to the extent that we're talking about. What I understood, if I can paraphrase what I got, is that it's everywhere, and it's really the security is with the data transferring from one to another is where it is. And then so from like protecting from a hack type of thing, that would be up to me to be careful on my passwords and how I, set securities and those kind of things.
Yes.
Because if there's some corruption or something within my network, whether it was on premises, like it lived here in the building with me, or if it lives on multiple different data centers, does that do anything to protect me, or is it really impinging?
Absolutely. The name of my company is HighVail Systems. It comes from the words high availability.
Okay.
So the idea of that is you are ensuring that your data doesn't necessarily sit only in one place. And this, by the way, is the practical side of the cloud for everybody. But your data is sitting in more than one location. So perhaps on your device, on your laptop, or something else, as well as within some cloud, whether it be iCloud, Dropbox is another example. These are all cloud-based systems. And by the way, they each have their own data centers, and not one, but multiple. And so there's a full copy of the data, and then there's sort of a portion of it, pointers, that allow you to rebuild from that. And a big part of my business has always been in backup and recovery. So we don't back everything up continuously. We back something up initially, and then we create pointers for changes. So it allows us to ensure availability of the data without necessarily having to have multiple copies. So in other words, and I'm sure many of the listeners have done this, where you're taking a copy of one thing and you're moving it over, let's say, to an external hard drive or something else. Same idea, right? So you have multiple copies of the data, but that data also has to be secure, has to be, a term we use a lot is encrypted. We encrypt that data sometimes, depending upon the requirements, depending upon the compliance requirements, because we do business with banks. There's a lot of compliance there. Everybody has some form of compliance, whether it be a public company or a private company. And I mean, we do it ourselves. I'm not concerned about the data, where I say, as long as I make sure that I put it in some form that can then be copied. So we've been using the cloud ourselves for quite a long time. Then I know my data is secure. And as far as the corruption that you mentioned, again, it becomes up to us to ensure that if there is corruption, that we have a way to recover from a point in time, so that we can then continue on, not only with our business, but even with our personal thing.
And to that point,
lost pictures, as an everybody's lost some of their pictures for whatever reason. But if you have more than one copy of your pictures, you're okay. As an example.
And that's what it is, that there are the lagging backups, if you will, that I like to call them, where they're physically disconnected from synchronization. So like, because you think, well, hold on, I'm on the cloud, I'm completely synchronized across all these data centers. So once I get intruded into one, it's just going to affect, it's going to infect all the other ones as well. But that's not necessarily true, because you can actually create some timed synchronization, so that when you detect an intrusion, you can actually shut down that data center and just move the pointers, as you said, to another data center. Is that correct, Bradley?
Exactly. Or another copy, not necessarily. It could be in another data center, could be even in the same place, but just another copy, a clean copy, to use a simple term, right?
So, because when you were talking about the pictures earlier and like transferring that file over, I'm thinking about like personally trying to protect pictures, and I'm thinking back to like wedding pictures, and we had this external hard drive that we bought to protect it, and we had this thing, and it lived in a fireproof safe somewhere, and when we actually went back to plug it in to go use it, couldn't get to anything. Right? So now
That's another problem.
yeah, so now we have a physical device and it's only one and there's one copy of it and there's nothing you can really do about it. And so it's interesting now that you explain it, like I'd feel a little more comfortable maybe taking those pictures and having them on the cloud so that if something happens, they're still available, or at least a better chance of them being available, if I understood that correctly.
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is, right? So, and by the way, you can still recover those pictures. You just need to find somebody who knows how to do it. Certainly not me, but there's a lot of people out there that can do that kind of stuff. At the end of the day, though, really what you want is you want to ensure that you have not only multiple copies of the data, and that's really, for me, now we're deviating from the cloud. Let's move back to the cloud. For me, I take it as a simple thing. My mom, a 95-year-old woman, went on Facebook not that long ago. And now I'm able to share with her pictures and other things. She's able to comment on things or whatever else. That's using a cloud, because ultimately it's how we interconnect, right? That's with Facebook. But when I go and see her, I'm able to download pictures to her, whatever it is, from my iCloud. Again, in this case, my personal stuff sits on iCloud, and give that to her without necessarily having the original copy sitting on my PC. I just download it from my phone. That's and I do have a lot of storage on my phone, but ultimately, I don't know about you guys, but I know my wife has like 40 or 50,000 pictures. She can't store it all on her phone. There's no way, right? Yeah. So that's where the cloud becomes very practical from a personal perspective. Banking is another example, right? That is a large, you're logging in directly to the bank, but they themselves, the availability of it is in multiple locations in the same way. It's using a private cloud in their case, but still a cloud, right? The cloud, as they call it.
Yeah, and I think that's where, like, from a risk assessment standpoint, and when we have conversations with clients around about what that looks like, and you start evaluating what's the risk of having it in your home. So, because we talk about, this is a software solution that exists to scale hardware solutions, right? Exactly. So you have one computer that's got one hard drive and one person managing it, and then you feel like you got a thing, but it's always one single point of failure. So you got one internet, one hard drive, one person, one computer. Each one of those things are single points of failure. Where now that you got a software, the cloud, that's managing an enormous group of hardware together, where they can move things around and be very, very
flexible,
available, right? That's probably one of the biggest concerns too, Bradley, is that I know what speed I'm paying for. I know my internet connection is secure and it's not, until it's not working no more. So now you got your whole organization that's down because your internet is down. So maybe can you talk a little bit more about that, as far as like the scalability of the cloud and what it actually does, not only for your internal personnel, but also for the for actual the reduction of those single points of failure in your organization.
Exactly. I mean, when I started in the industry about 36 years ago, people were replacing typewriters with desktop computers, but then they started networking those computers. And then from an availability perspective, and that's how I personally got involved in the whole area of high availability, it really became a question of building the same thing, making it redundant. One data center, two data centers, three data centers, larger customers, big telecom customers and banks and others. They could afford to do that. But for the average small or mid-sized business, availability for them became in the same data center, right? They had one building, and the data center wasn't a data center. It was a closet in the back of the office or whatever it might be, but they had two computers. So for them, they were highly available. Well, now you can use the cloud to do the same thing. So we're actually moving customers, and I mentioned backup and recovery before. So just their backups today using the cloud, so to speak, right? One of the large cloud providers, whether it be the AWS or one of the others, IBM has a cloud, Oracle has, everybody has there's hundreds of clouds out there, basically. But using that as the backup. so to speak, right? The redundant aspect of it. And the only way that you can do that is, as you mentioned, through your internet connection. I shouldn't say it's the only way, but it's the smart way to do it today, because to create dedicated connections is very costly. So, if I look at what it costs today to interconnect even 2 data centers for a customer, I shouldn't say a data center, 2 buildings for a customer in 2 different locations, the cost to do that is exponential. So as much as, hundreds of times more expensive, but certainly dozens or tens of times more expensive than using an internet, not an internet, but a cloud provider, and using your internet connection to get out, because you have the internet connection already. So it just becomes a question of not only securing it in the way that you need to, but also ensuring that you have the bandwidth, right, to basically run your business on. And you don't need, so we no longer have any infrastructure on site in our own office. We've been using a remote data center for years with a dedicated connection. Now we use the internet, not only to our own computer, which sits in a remote data center, but now we no longer have to build. I used to have multiple racks of equipment, not only to run the business, but to do testing. Today, everything sits in a cloud somewhere. So whether it be the manufacturer or one of the service providers like AWS, or even frankly, dedicated providers out there, which we also use from time to time. It's all cloud-based. It's all I need is my internet connection. That's it. Does that answer your question, guys?
Yeah, for sure. Because one of the things I remember dealing with insurance companies and law firms, where they always have to consider force majeure, right? So,
Right.
So what happens if I'm the carrier or I'm the person holding all these files for my client, and then my office also gets taken away? How do we actively protect our clients from the potential disaster of our own office? So that was a question that came up a lot. And to your point, back in the day, what we would do is we would actually move the data from, one city's office to another office in a different city that was far enough that the chances of a natural disaster in both cities were very, very low or slim. So this way you've got a copy of your information somewhere else. But to your point, it was one of those things where they had to do it through the night, because during the day it was too heavy because people wanted to use the system, and then lots of timing. So what I like to talk about is that from now, that because it's all managed through software on the cloud, you've got access to basically an unlimited amount of hardware, and it's just from one switch to another to say, I want more, I want less. I want this door shut off for security. I want this door open. It becomes a game of configurations rather than a game of managing your hardware infrastructure in your office, so to speak. Am I correct, Bradley?
Absolutely. And that's the business mindset. And if you take it from the individual mindset, it's really the same thing. Software as a service, right? Which is your business go. That's what you provide. SaaS-based solutions that are out there today are much more not only cost-effective, but much more secure and can scale, right? You used the term before, and I marked it down because you used the term at scale, right? It's a term that's used continuously within the business world, obviously, that really provides you with an unlimited amount of infrastructure, amount of compute power and storage, right? Again, coming back to what we used to do with customers, and we still do, we still put infrastructure on premise, as you mentioned before. But in all cases, they're utilizing a public cloud of some sort in addition to what they have on premise. And it's all because of the software as a service mentality. Companies like Salesforce and others that have risen, over the years, really only provide their solutions through that method, right? Which is, I'm using my internet connection to run an application. We all have apps on our phone. It's the same thing. Businesses run in the exact same way. So again, it's scale. It's all about how can I scale up? How can I grow? How can I get from my business what I need without having to spend money that I don't have or money that really isn't necessary? And that's really leveraging the cloud. That's what it is.
Every worker deserves to go home safely at the end of the day. Book a demo with Sophie to discover how their groundbreaking EHS management software empowers workers to proactively avoid hazards and how organizations like yours can cultivate a stronger work culture. Visit them at sophie.com to learn more. Technica Mining is a premier underground mining and construction contractor. They stand for delivering quality project work on time and on budget through innovative thinking. Their excellent safety record, experienced workforce, and large equipment fleet will guarantee the timely completion of all your project needs. Trusted by the world's leading mining companies, Technica Mining has over 20 years of experience in mine construction, development, and production. Contact Technica Mining to take your next mining project to the next level. Visit them at technicamining.com. Change Itself is produced by Crownsman, the voice of industry. Check out more, including The Crownsman Show, Mining Now, The Building Energy Show, and Agriculture Now at crownsman.com.
There's probably I've got many years in this as well, and I remember having the pager on my hip, and I remember having the phone, the phone also attached and things like that, and whenever things happen, I had to literally run over and reboot a server or have manual intervention. And now that we've implemented everything through AWS, we get a notification that says, hey, we noticed that there was degradation on the service that you have. We moved it over to another server. We're taking care of the old one. On you go. There's no interruption. So when it comes to having a conversation about risk management, and having a good understanding of how you're putting controls in place to reduce risk of your data. Have you had some that stood out, Bradley, over time as you've done those risk assessments with clients that you're like, oh, what? This is actually a control that we never really thought was, but it actually is coming through all because of the cloud.
Well, yeah. And I mean, you just mentioned it before, right? Just getting alerts. We can automate things today where, and the pandemic showed that to us, every individual, is that you don't have to be on site to reboot a server or to do things like that. And it's not even a question of anymore. You really haven't had to do it for quite a long time already, but now it's become much more acceptable. So it's the ubiquity, again, to use a term that, gets used a lot in our industry. It's the ubiquity and the availability of not only the systems, but the applications, right? That's really what you need to see from a business perspective that are out there for you. And when your internet connection goes down, as we all had an experience recently with the Rogers network, it really puts everything at a complete standstill because the ubiquity that exists out there and the fact that those service providers aren't interconnected, and they need to be. And that's now becoming legislation that the government is putting in place that's forcing that to happen today, right? Recent news for those that I live in, in the GTA, there's recent news about the TTC, and Rogers won a contract to deploy their cellular network. It's microcells. It's existed again for a long time. I don't know why they didn't do it, but within the subway network in Toronto, right, the TTC network. And Bell raised an issue, I think, with the CRTC. I don't even know if it's a legal case, because Rogers was limiting their access to that. Well, you can't do that. You need to have the availability, a nonpartisan, to use a very overly used term out of the American political system, a nonpartisan approach between the service providers, really, because that's the only layer of uncertainty that can happen because our internet connection is so important to us. But as long as that internet connection is functional, really there's no stopping you, as the expression goes, right? You can grow as far and as wide as you need to.
And I guess, and then we're seeing it now, even now with Petro-Canada, right? With they had a current mishap with their connectivity, and now there's no more transaction terminals. It's cash only terminals, right?
That's right.
You have to have that redundancy and that failover.
You need to have that. You must have that. And if you don't, that's, our internet connection. I mean, today we don't need the redundancy that we used to in our own office, but we used to have both a Bell and a Rogers connection in our offices because we knew as long as one was running, the other wasn't. And coming from where I do in the industry, I used to do a lot of business with Rogers, with other telco, both equipment and service providers. And you asked about some examples. I'll give you a good example in a moment. But when I did business with these guys, the Rogers guys carried Bell pagers because if their cell phone network went down, at least they had their Bell pager and their network was up. And the pager was Bell tone, as they refer to it. That's where the term basically, and then it became web tone later on, which basically means 100% availability. That pager network, and you guys, especially up in the northern areas of Quebec and Ontario, truly relied on that. Never went down, ever. It was impossible. But the cellular network and the cable networks have had issues because they have single points of failure. And I had a situation a long time ago when I was first deploying systems into Rogers at the time, where a service provider, not a telco service provider, needed to dig and dug and broke a wire, right? Severed a wire. And that wire happened to be the main connection coming into a data center. So it brought everything down. And there was redundancy in the mainframes. There was redundancy in all of their larger systems. But on their mid-range systems, the vast majority, and that was things like email and other things that people had on their desktop and other and other solutions, they didn't have it. So those people were all, obviously their connection was down, the power connection was down. But in our case, we had redundancy built into, these were for billing systems. So the interface to the main switches. And our billing system continued to operate without a hiccup. Unfortunately, the billing system itself wasn't, but that was another story. But we were able to continue to operate. So there's a situation where redundancy is extremely important. This was one single connection into that building, and they severed it. So they were down for hours. It's many, many years ago. Won't talk about
I think Eric's got some examples like that too, from where they are, where there's only one provider down the street, and when there's an internet or when there's a power interruption, that provider is sitting on that internet on that power grid, and then the power goes down, the internet goes, everything's down.
everything's down.
Oh, we've had some of those for sure, and then it impacts, could impact, especially if we had back when we had on-prem stuff, our sites that were, relying on that internet connection and remoting into those, which we've had some significant downtime and delays over those things for sure. One of the things I find interesting, you guys keep talking about, is this resiliency of the system, the redundancy, and that, from my world and what I deal with in risk management and health and safety, we often talk about failing safe. So how do you fail safe? You have an event and then, it's not catastrophic. So I'm really hearing a lot of those very similar frameworks and things that you guys talk about. Bradley, do you guys use any types of risk assessments in the work that you do with your clients?
So typically, I shouldn't say we don't do risk assessments, but we do, obviously, in terms of the system side. But we're typically working with clients that really look at their risk, their own risk, and then provide us with guidelines around that. And we'll look at the systems themselves and ensure that the systems are able to respond to those guidelines, or able to deliver that resiliency, right? That availability, that's required. So that's really where it comes from, and has always been sort of in that mode. We ourselves are not and I shouldn't say we're not in the risk business, because we are, right? That's the whole concept around high availability, is that if you're ensuring availability of the systems, and trust me, I pay enough insurance as a result of this, right? You're ensuring that, there's uptime for the customers in terms of what they're looking for, as a delivery to their customers, right? Because that's really what we're doing. We deal primarily with businesses that are working with end customers. In some cases, it's individual consumers, but for the most part, it's and that's in the case of banks. That's a lot of individual consumers, but it's also business to business for them, right? So they have requirements that are provided to them by their end customers. So we deliver around those requirements.
Okay, makes a lot of sense for me. So I identify a couple of risks. I give you the scope of what they are, and you would be able to deliver on how to prevent those things from happening.
Right,
And it's on the system and the data side.
Exactly.
See the point of failure, one fiber coming into my site, and somebody hits a shovel. It's really out of the system and the clouds kind of realm at that point, unless I have Starlink or some other availability.
Yeah, we delivered something many years ago for another customer where they asked us to look at their systems in their data center around, was it compliant, was it redundant, etc. And what we found is that they had systems that were redundant, sitting literally one on top of the other. In some cases, underneath the halon for the sprinkler system, and oftentimes with multiple power connections to the same power source. Right? There's no redundancy in that, right? Because if the power goes down, you're cooked, right? If that source of power goes down, you're cooked, or something happens and the halon goes off. Like, you have to ensure that you're doing the things that are required yourself, right? So that's part of what we cover, frankly, in the majority of what we cover, because our business is really an infrastructure business. But we also do a lot of work around the application and availability and the automation of things for our customers, right? And delivering, again, more flexibility, more scalability for them. And that's a lot of what we're doing for Gus is for Sophie. Exactly.
So we talked about the cloud. There's the cloud computing. So is there systems and things running in the background in those data centers? Like, if there's programs running there. You talked about pointers.
Well, that's for the redundancy or the replication of copies of the data itself, right? That's one part of it. But then for the systems themselves, there are, and we deliver automation solutions to our customers to automate a lot of those functions, right? So how things are being backed up, where they're being backed up to, how they can be recovered, and we test that, right? So we do a lot of work with customers around their disaster recovery planning. We don't build the plan, but again, we help and provide the services around the systems to ensure that they're compliant with that DR plan that they have.
What about?
And I think for the other part of the computing is also the calculations side of things, right? Especially now that we're dealing with so much data sciences and people want to do so many analytics.
Yes.
If people depended on local infrastructure to do their calculations or their computing of entries,
you can't.
You would never be able to keep up with the overall cost and demand of that. So now you can actually say, hey, let's commission something on the cloud for half an hour. Let's call on the whole troops to make this calculation happen, get the calculation done, and then release the resources. So at that point, that's another process. That's another part of the scalability. It's not just the availability of the applications, but now that we're dealing on data sciences, we have to have massive calculations. That I think that's another use case around cloud computing and its power.
Absolutely. Because again, that's the scale, right? That's the scale aspect, right? How do you deliver these massive calculations? And you're using the term calculation, and that's actually the right term because it is background calculations, right? They use the term logs or logarithms, right? Or how things are, the analytics are done on that data, right? To understand things. You can't, and I shouldn't say you can't, you can obviously build an infrastructure to do that. But ultimately, if you look at even, Intel announced something this week with, and I can't remember who it was with. It's with one of the providers around building a supercomputer. I mean, for an individual to build a supercomputer, an individual business or the universities used to have large supercomputers. You can't do that, right? The cost would be prohibitive, right? And the need, as you said, you need it for half an hour, once a month, or whatever it might be, right? Whatever the requirements are. So using an external provider to deliver that through the cloud is really the most cost-effective way to scale.
So some of that automation is like, if I'm making a query and it's a large one, is that turning things on, like turning the tap on so that computation's happening faster, and then I don't need it anymore, the tap goes down, and then that requirement from the system reduces? Is that kind of what you guys are talking about?
Really, that's exactly what it is, right? I'm turning on the tap because I need to fill up a kettle of water, right? Once I fill the kettle, I turn off the tap.
Okay.
You're not keeping the tap running 24 hours a day. Now, this is one of the myths that exist around the cloud. It existed, it probably still exists to a certain extent, is I turn things on and I forget to turn them off. So customers still do that, and they're overpaying for things. There's no question. One of the things that we've been doing a lot with customers and continue to do now is to deliver solutions to help automate the tasks so that they don't keep things turned on continuously.
Okay.
They only turn it on when they need it, because you're paying for the cloud. Sometimes it's per second, right? It depends what you're doing. So you don't want to pay for things that you're not using, obviously.
Absolutely not.
So as far as if some of our audience, as we start wrapping things up here, if they're on the fence or they're deliberating right now whether right now is the good time to go to the cloud, and because maybe they're in the process of potentially having to put together a budget to replace their internal infrastructure, or they're adding on more services where now they have to upgrade their internal. So now they're making that conscious evaluation between, do we stay internal, do we go to the cloud? What would be your word of advice for them as far as what they need to consider for the cloud at this point?
Well, it's really a question of, first of all, comfort level. There is no question that that's it. You have to be comfortable enough to deliver that. But if you look today at, an average size company's accounting, right, that you're doing, you could be using QuickBooks or, one of the other applications that exist out there. They're all cloud-based today. Even if you have it, on your own server, you can move that to a cloud-based system, right? Anything. So when you're beginning to look at things, it becomes, how comfortable are you with moving things off your own premise and basically taking the blanket off, right? And allowing things to run elsewhere. That's the first thing to consider. The second thing to consider is flexibility. We have, as I mentioned to you guys before, we scaled down our office size for a variety of different reasons, obviously through the pandemic. And I didn't do it because I reduced the size of the company. I reduced the size of my office because everybody's working from home. They don't need to come to the office. And they also don't need to go to their customers' offices, right? Because everything can be done remotely. Well, it's the same thing. If you require that remote work capability, making things cloud-based becomes a much more cost-effective, a much more flexible, and actually a much more secure way of doing it. There's no question. Talk to us, right? I'm out there. This is my sales pitch. I'm willing to talk to you about it. It won't be me. It'll be people that actually understand how things work. I don't understand how things work anymore outside of what I've said today. But, at the end of the day, that's really what it is. It's comfort level. It's flexibility. And if you need to do a replacement, it's a great time to look at the cloud. There is no question. Or you need to add more reliability or redundancy for whatever it is, right? Copying your data. Instead of backing it up to tape, which you might be doing today, start thinking about using an appliance to back things out to the cloud. Using a virtual machine on your servers, which you can create, and then using the cloud, storage on the cloud, as the target for that. And then that storage then becomes replicated onto multiple sites. If you buy that service, of course, you have to subscribe to that service. And when you're looking at it, it's the same thing around security. And as I mentioned early on, we're not a cybersecurity company, but I have partners who really help customers that are either already using the cloud or moving to the cloud. And everybody's using the cloud in some way. There's no question. Nobody can say if you run a business today, you're definitely using the cloud. But they start looking at the security and what that requirement is, right? What do I need to put on the individual devices, whether they be phones, laptops, etc.? What do people need to have in their homes to ensure the security, if that's part of it, to ensure that they have the security that they're compliant with the company's security level. These are all things that can be moved and done through a SaaS-based model, which is what the cloud is, right? Running your applications in the cloud.
Very good. Well, thanks a lot for that, Bradley. And I hope that we gave everybody a little bit more comfort around what the cloud is and what the potentials are that exist there. And, you know, there are some situations where you need a hybrid system because you also need to do a failover from the cloud. So in the event that you do get disconnected, you do have some stuff on-prem. So there are a multitude of solutions out there. And I thought it was just important to open that up. Did that answer a few of the questions that you had, Eric, as well, as far as the mystical cloud?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thank you again, Bradley. I got a much better understanding of it, and was able to create some models for myself on how it might be. I can think about it a little simpler, but yeah, no, definitely much appreciated. And I like the idea of that redundancy and that fail-safe approach to it.
Well, thank you for having me, guys. I appreciate it. I hope I've demystified some things, as Eric was mentioning. And, really at the end of the day, it's about your own comfort level and understanding that really you're already there. So it's just a question of taking that next step or those next steps to move you a little bit further along. And it's really, I mentioned at one point the Industrial Revolution. Consider this is the next phase, that started 160 years ago, basically, when the Industrial Revolution started up. That's really the direction that you have to think that things are going. This is just the next phase.
Right on. Well, I hope everybody watching enjoyed that episode and the content that we delivered today. And again, as usual, we're looking forward to your comments. Hit that like button if you really enjoyed it. And if you're on our YouTube channel, go ahead and ring that bell so you get notifications. And if you want to get in touch with Bradley, so it's Bradley Brodkin from HighVail. And you'll be able to look him up on LinkedIn. He's an active LinkedIn subscriber, as well as, is it highvailsystems.com or highvail.com?
No, it's highvail.com, HighVail. So getting high on Vail, but that's not what it stands for. Right. But I have been doing it. But that's really what it is, highvail.com. And yeah, please be in touch. Happy to answer anybody's questions and obviously point you in the right direction.
Right on. Thanks, Bradley. Thanks, Eric.